The air was thick with a foreboding silence, broken only by the faint rhythm of hoofbeats growing louder. Distant but deliberate, the sound crept into the hearts of the villagers, each thud a harbinger of doom. The faint glow of torches flickered against the horizon, their orange light licking the darkened sky. From his vantage in the dimly lit inn, Albert tightened his grip on the weathered edge of the table. Beside him, the innkeeper's wife wrung her hands, her knuckles white against her trembling fingers. Her husband stood by the door, clutching a rusted pitchfork as if its mere presence could stave off the inevitable.
Who's coming?
The woman whispered, her voice a fragile thread of terror. Albert's eyes remained fixed on the horizon.
I see them.
He murmured, his voice betraying none of the growing knot in his chest.
Stay inside. Whatever happens, do not run.
A muffled sob escaped the woman's lips, and Albert turned to meet her gaze.
The Order has no mercy for heresy. Real or imagined.
He continued, more to himself than to her.
But the justice, it's indiscriminate.
Suddenly, the hoofbeats surged into a chaotic crescendo. The riders burst into the village like wolves into a den of lambs, their cloaks billowing like shadows, and their drawn swords catching the firelight. The scream of a woman shattered the brittle stillness as doors were torn from their hinges and villagers dragged from their homes. Some begged, some resisted, and others simply froze in terrified silence. Albert leaned against the rough wooden wall of the inn, peering through the half-shuttered window. His sharp eyes caught the unmistakable heraldry on the riders' pennons, scarlet banners emblazoned with the black sigil of the Acturian Order. Whispers of heresy, of witchcraft had haunted this region, and now the Order had come to enforce their grim judgment.
They claim they purge for the Five.
He muttered, bitterness dripping from his words.
But this is nothing but conquest in the guise of righteousness.
The door burst open, and two knights in the Order's grim attire stormed in, their polished armor streaked with the soot of burning homes. One of them, a grizzled man with a face carved from stone, pointed his sword at Albert.
You. Out. Now.
Albert raised his hands slowly, his expression calm but calculating.
I am but traveler,
he said, his voice steady.
No ties to this land.
The knight's companion, a younger, fiercer man, grabbed the innkeeper by his collar.
And them? Are they heretics or your accomplices?
They are nothing.
Albert interjected coldly, drawing their attention.
Simple folk who keep to themselves.
The younger knight sneered.
Then they won't mind watching their village burned.
Without waiting for a reply, the knights gestured for all three of them to exit. Outside, the village square had turned into a scene from nightmares. Men and women knelt in the dirt, bound and beaten, as flames consumed their homes. Near the well, Albert's gaze locked onto a burly man, likely the village elder, being dragged by his hair toward the growing pyre. Fragments of desperate cries floated through the chaos, carrying half-heard accusations of witchcraft and consorting with the forbidden. Albert clenched his fists as the heat of the flames licked at his skin. Behind him, the innkeeper's wife whimpered softly, her eyes darting from the knights to her husband. The grizzled knight leaned close to Albert, his breath heavy with ale and blood.
You know what we do to heretics,
he said.
If you value your life, you will answer questions truthfully.
Albert gave no response, his mind racing. Somewhere amidst the carnage, an ember of a plan began to spark. As Albert approached the pyre, a man in ornate blackened steel armor stepped into his path. His helm bore the sigil of the Acturian Order, and his stern gaze burned with righteous fury. This was Brother Gendry, a legio custos of the Order, whose loyalty to the Five was as unyielding as the steel of his sword.
Please, brother, I'm just a simple servant of Beltar.
Brother of Beltar, you say?
Gendry's voice was a deep growl, laden with suspicion.
What does a servant of death know of heresy?
Albert held his ground, his face shadowed by his hood.
I know that Beltar does not grant his servants the power to save lives, only for them to stand idle while the innocent burn.
Innocent?
Gendry barked a laugh, his gauntleted hand gripping the hilt of his sword.
You would defend a village steeped in heresy? Their corruption stinks, brother, and you reek of it as well.
Before Albert could respond, another figure strode into the circle of light, a younger knight with a crimson cloak and the insignia of a Vexilius. Haragon, his expression calm but calculating, raised a hand to still Gendry's ire.
Peace, brother Gendry.
Haragon said, his voice smooth but firm.
Let the men speak.
Albert turned to Haragon, inclining his head slightly.
Brother Vexilius, I am no friend to heresy, but death has its place, and this
He gestured to the chaos around them.
is not it. Beldar teaches us to guide the dead to the final rest, not to hasten their arrival for forced charges.
Haragon narrowed his eyes.
And how do you know these charges are false, brother?
Because I'm trained to feel death's approach,
Albert replied.
and I do not feel the mark of heresy here, only fear and the stench of desperation.
The knights exchanged uneasy glances, and Haragon seemed to consider Albert's words, but Gendry was unmoved.
Fear and desperation are tools of heretics.
Gendry snapped.
I trust not your words. Rather, you may serve Beldar, but your allegiance to the Five seem questionable.
Albert took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper.
Do not mistake my calm for weakness, brother. I will not allow you to butcher these people under guise of righteousness.
The witch! There's a witch in the village!
A shrill voice cut through the crackling of flames. Gendry's stern face cracked into a cruel smile. He released his grip on the village elder, who slumped to his knees in the mud. Without a word, the Custos gestured to 3 of his knights, and they moved as one toward the outskirts of the village, their armor gleaming orange in the firelight. Albert watched, his jaw clenched, as the knights approached a small cottage nestled against the tree line. The door splintered under their boots, and screams erupted from within. A young woman burst through the doorway, her dark hair wild and her nightgown torn. Behind her, a man, perhaps her husband or brother, lunged forward with a fishing spear.
No!
Leave her!
His cry ended in a wet gurgle as one of the knights ran him through with practiced efficiency. The body crumpled to the ground, steam rising from the growing pool of blood in the cold night air. The woman's hysteria peaked as the knights seized her. She thrashed and screamed words Albert couldn't quite catch, pleas of innocence, perhaps, or desperate prayers. Gendry silenced her with a mailed fist to the face. Her words dissolved into confused whimpers as they dragged her toward the village center. Near the well, another group of knights worked with grim purpose, lashing together poles and kindling into a crude pyre. The smell of pitch and tar mingled with the smoke already thick in the air. Albert stood rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the symphony of horror around him. To his left, a mother clutched her children to her breast, their faces streaked with tears and soot. To his right, an old man lay face down in the dirt, blood seeping from beneath his skull. Somewhere, a dog howled, and the sound seemed to carry all the village's terror and pain. The knights stripped the accused witch with methodical cruelty, ignoring her attempts to cover herself. Her skin was pale in the firelight, marked with fresh bruises. They bound her to the hastily constructed stake, the rough rope cutting into her flesh as she struggled weakly. Albert felt bile rise in his throat as the torches touched the kindling. The woman's screams changed then, becoming something primal and inhuman. The flames climbed higher, and the acrid smell of burning flesh began to spread across the village little square.
Brother,
The voice was quiet, but commanding. Albert turned to find Oraculus Decathamarch standing beside him, his weathered face illuminated by the pyre's glow. The man's eyes seemed to pierce through Albert, searching for something in his soul. After a long moment, The Oraculus made a subtle gesture toward the ground before the burning stake.
Let us pray
He said, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath its pious tone.
for her soul, if not her flesh.
Albert understood the command beneath the invitation. Oraculus was quite a high rank in that kind of order. Supposedly, he was the head of this banner. He knelt beside the Oraculus in the blood-soaked earth, keenly aware of the dying woman's screams and the weight of the elder priest's suspicious gaze. As they began their prayers to Belthar, Albert couldn't shake the feeling that he was kneeling before two fires, one that consumed flesh, and another that threatened to consume his carefully constructed identity. The village square was a spectacle of horror and fire. Flames from the pyre painted the surrounding ruins in violent shades of orange and red, while acrid smoke climbed into the starless sky. Orden was just a meter beside Albert, the Oraculus's iron gaze fixed on the dancing flames consuming the herbalist's lifeless form. His voice, steady yet edged with judgment, broke the silence.
Can you feel it, brother of Belthar?
He asked, his tone as cold as the steel of a sacrificial blade. Friars of such high rank must have recognized Albert's monastic affiliation in the blink of an eye. After all, he wore the unmistakable wooden amulet of Belthar around his neck for a reason.
The cleansing fire devours heresy, living only to the purity of ash. A gift to the five, a tribute to their will.
Albert swallowed hard, the smoke biting at his throat as he forced himself to respond.
I feel the weight of the justice, brother Oraculus. But I question whether the flames ever truly know the innocent from the guilty.
Orden's head turned slightly, with his pale eyes narrowing.
Justice is not ours to determine. That burden belongs to the Divine Five. We are but their instruments, wielding the fire they command. Do you doubt their wisdom?
The sharpness of the accusation sent a chill down Albert's spine. He lowered his head, letting the flickering light play over his features, casting deep shadows across his face.
I do not doubt the five, nor the sanctity of their judgment. But men are feeble, and a fire burns all with the same fury.
For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling wood of the pyre. Orden's lips tightened, but his gaze softened, if only slightly.
You speak as one who has seen much suffering. Tell me, brother, what do you pray for, kneeling here in this place of judgment?
Albert hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He searched for something that would both placate Orden and give voice to his own doubts. Finally he spoke, his voice low and trembling.
I pray for clarity, brother Oraculus. Clarity to see heresy where it hides, and mercy to guide our hand when doubt clouds our sight. The five are merciful as well as just, are they not?
The Oraculus frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. He glanced at the remains of the pyre, then back to Albert.
The five are indeed merciful. But mercy is their domain, not ours. A weak hand wavers, brother, and a wavering hand invites corruption. Do you believe this village elder he defended was free from sin?
Albert's heart raced. Each word felt like walking a tightrope above a pit of jagged blades.
No man is free from sin,
He admitted, his voice gaining a steadiness he didn't feel.
but not all sins merits the fire. If we burn them all, what shepherds will remain for the flocks left behind?
Orden straightened, his hands resting on his thighs. The firelight cast jagged shadows across his severe features.
You are bold, for one so young.
He said finally, his tone both admiring and cautioning.
Perhaps your faith is strong enough to endure such questions. But remember this, brother of Belthar. Doubt is a seed, and if let to grow, it will poison the root.
Albert bowed his head deeply, his voice barely above a whisper.
I will guard my thoughts and prayers, brother Oraculus. The Five teaches us that even doubt must be burned away.
Ordon nodded, apparently satisfied. He rose from his kneeling position and gestured for Albert to follow.
Come, there's much to be done. Heresy lives bodies, and bodies attract wolves. The Five's work does not end with judgment.
As they turned toward the remains of the village, Albert cast one last glance at the smoldering pyre. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them before him, whispering silently,
Mercy is not ours, but perhaps it should be.
The prayer ended, but the weight of Ordon's scrutiny lingered like a physical presence on Albert's shoulders. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a reminder of how precarious his position had become. The Oraculus's piercing gaze had stripped away his carefully constructed facade, leaving him feeling exposed, vulnerable. Yet beneath the fear churned an odd sense of relief. Perhaps the Order's presence here had nothing to do with him at all. They seemed far too preoccupied with their current butchery to be hunting a single fugitive from the east. The night air had grown colder, carrying the acrid scent of smoke and something far worse. Around him, the village of Stinking Pork had been transformed into a tableau of horror that even his years of studying death's mysteries hadn't prepared him for. The flames casting wild shadows across the blood-stained ground reminded him of the stories he'd read about the Northern Order's origins, tales that now seemed to mock the present reality. As he rose from his knees, Albert's gaze swept across the village square, taking in the grim spectacle. The scene before him spoke volumes about the Acturian Order's evolution from its noble origins. Like many of the Northern Orders, they had begun as guardians, protectors of civilization against the savage tribes that dwelled in the ice mountains. In those days, their purpose had been clear: defend the realms of men from the barbarous hordes that threatened to descend from the frozen wastes. The history of these orders was written in blood and ice. For centuries, they had stood as bulwarks against the wild folk of the north, their fortress monasteries dotting the harsh landscape like islands of civilization in a sea of savagery. The Acturian Order had been among the most prestigious, their twin-headed griffin banner striking fear into the hearts of raiders and bringing hope to the settlers who lived in the shadow of the ice mountains. But times had changed. The northern threats had receded, and the orders had been forced to adapt or fade into irrelevance. Some, like the Knights of Reclaimed Earth, still maintained their ancient vigil, engaging in regular skirmishes with the wild folk beyond the frontier. Others had turned to missionary work, spreading the faith of the five gods to the untamed lands of the northwest and east. Each order had carved out its own path through the changing times, some clinging to tradition, others embracing new purposes. The Acturian Order, however, had chosen a darker path. With no external enemies to fight, they had turned their gaze inward, transforming themselves into a theocratic state that ruled through fear and faith in equal measure. Their bronze and silver griffin, once a symbol of protection, had become an omen of impending judgment. What puzzled Albert most was their presence this far south, in the Reginian protectorate of Serdia. These lands had their own protectors, their own laws. The Order's intrusions spoke of either desperation or ambition. Neither boded well for the surrounding territories. From his position near the burned-out pyre, Albert watched as Brother Gendry emerged from the shadows, his armor still stained with the night's work. The Legio Custos's face was illuminated by the dying flames, casting deep shadows across his features that made him appear more demon than man. Behind him, Vicroy Scridge directed a group of soldiers with silent gestures, their movements precise and practiced, speaking of too much experience in such matters.
You seem troubled, brother of Belthar.
Gendry's voice dripped with sarcastic concern.
Perhaps some physical labor will help clear your mind.
He gestured toward the pile of bodies that had begun to accumulate at the village's edge.
These heretics won't bury themselves.
Before Albert could respond, a woman's scream pierced the night, quickly muffled. From a nearby house came the sound of breaking furniture and rough laughter. He caught a glimpse of Vexilius Haragon turning away, his face a mask of studied indifference as his men took their spoils of victory. The Vexiliuses' carefully maintained neutrality seemed to Albert almost worse than Gendry's open cruelty. At least the latter was honest in its brutality. The ritual began as the last rays of sunlight painted the western sky in shades of blood and gold. The surviving villagers, those deemed salvageable by the Order's inscrutable standards, were led to the outskirts of their ruined home. Albert watched in horrified fascination as the brothers donned what ceremonial garments they had brought, scarlet sashes and armbands that caught the dying light like fresh wounds against their dark armor. The symbolic transformation seemed to change them, turning men into vessels of divine judgment. Senior Custos Vicroy Skriga stepped forward, his weathered face illuminated by the torch he carried. The ancient words of the cleansing ritual rolled from his tongue in practiced cadence, each syllable heavy with centuries of tradition. Albert recognized the litany from his studies, though he had never imagined he would witness it firsthand. The smell of sacred oils and burning herbs began to mingle with the more profane odors of death and destruction. The brothers formed their circle, each holding a torch lit from the main fire. Their shadows danced grotesquely on the ground, merging and separating like spirits caught between worlds. The prisoners knelt in their shallow graves, their faces reflecting varying degrees of terror and resignation. Some prayed, their lips moving in desperate whispers. Others simply stared ahead, already dead in all but body. Skriga's voice rose and fell in the ancient patterns, asking Orion's forgiveness for the souls they were about to send to his judgment. The ritual words spoke of mercy and cleansing, but to Albert's ears they rang hollow, a thin veneer of righteousness over acts of simple brutality. He found himself wondering if the brothers truly believed their own liturgy, or if they too saw the hypocrisy in their actions. As the night wore on, Albert found himself pressing his sleeve against his nose, trying to filter out the stench of burning flesh. The cleansing continued until dawn threatened to break, the brothers working with mechanical efficiency to dispose of the dead and purify the living. Some villagers survived their cleansing. Many did not. The ones who lived would carry their scars, visible and invisible, as testament to the Order's version of mercy. When the last body had been consigned to the earth or flames, Gendry personally escorted Albert to one of the few remaining barns. Inside, knights and soldiers sprawled on borrowed bedding and stolen furs, passing wineskins and boasting of their victories. He noted the careful arrangement. The higher-ranking brothers claimed the clean straw near the barn's center, while lower-ranked soldiers huddled near the drafty walls. The hierarchy of the Order maintained even in their revelry. The air was thick with the smell of spilled wine and unwashed bodies. Some men sang bawdy songs, while others argued over their shares of the night's plunder. A few had already passed out, their snores mixing with the general cacophony. Albert noticed that Oraculus de Cathamarch was conspicuously absent. Such base celebrations were beneath his station. He found a relatively quiet corner, far from the revelry. As he lay down, the sounds of drunken celebration began to blur, with the screams that still echoed in his memory. Sleep came eventually, but it brought no peace. In his dreams, he saw the faces of the dead, their accusations silent but damning. And behind them all stood Orden, watching, always watching, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. The last thing Albert registered before exhaustion claimed him completely was the distant sound of wolves, drawn by the smell of death. Their howls seemed to carry a warning, though whether for the living or the dead, he couldn't say. In the darkness behind his closed eyes, the twin-headed griffin of the Acturian Order seemed to watch him with all four of its predatory eyes, waiting for him to make a fatal mistake.